The earliest Christian communities did not share a unified understanding of the divine hierarchy. The texts they produce reflect competing interpretations that developed simultaneously, not sequentially. In the earliest layer, Paul's letters, the divine structure is described in terms of cosmic forces that predate creation and continue to operate within the world. Paul references rulers, authorities, powers, and dominions as distinct entities functioning within a layered spiritual environment. These descriptions are not symbolic. They correspond directly to Second Temple Jewish cosmology, where multiple heavenly beings occupy defined roles within the unseen realm. Paul situates Christ within this system, portraying him as an elevated figure who surpasses these cosmic powers, not as a being inherently identical to the highest divine source. The Gospel of John introduces a different framework. Here, the Logos is presented as pre-existent, active in creation, and distinct from the Father. The opening lines describe the Logos as being with God and simultaneously engaged in the act of creation. This duality reflects Hellenistic Jewish thought, particularly the concept of the divine word as an intermediary principle. The text does not merge these identities into a single figure. It maintains relational language throughout. The Logos reveals the Father but is not described as the origin of the Father. This distinction is preserved across the entire narrative, demonstrating that the Johannine tradition operates with a different cosmological model than the Pauline texts. The Shepherd of Hermas, a text highly valued in several early Christian communities, presents yet another configuration. In this writing, the Holy Spirit is described as the first creation of God and the one through whom the world was made. This position places the Spirit at the beginning of the cosmic order. The language is explicit. The Spirit is the pre-existent entity entrusted with the task of supporting the formation of creation. Christ is described as the servant of this Spirit, functioning in a role defined by obedience and moral purity. This structure contradicts the later standardized model in which the Spirit emerges as a derivative or secondary figure. Additional early writings, such as the Odes of Solomon, portray a divine relationship that operates through emanation rather than equivalence. The texts speak of a Father who pours forth a power or presence that reveals his nature. This emanated presence interacts with the world and enables transformation. The relationship is active and dynamic, with no indication of a co-equal or co-eternal doctrine. The structure aligns more closely with Jewish mystical traditions than with the later doctrine formalized in 4th century councils. These writings demonstrate that the earliest Christians did not assume a fixed theological model. Other documents, like the Epistle of Barnabas, emphasize the pre-existence of Christ but do not depict him as identical with the highest divine source. Instead, Christ is portrayed as an agent who executes the will of God in both creation and redemption. The distinction is maintained in the grammatical structure, where actions are attributed to Christ on behalf of the Father. This reflects an agency model similar to those found in earlier Jewish texts, where figures such as wisdom or the angel of the Lord act with divine authority without being equated with the supreme deity. The Nag Hammadi Christian texts introduce further variations. In the trimorphic protonoia, the divine figure operates through 3 modes of revelation, but these modes are presented as manifestations of a single transcendent source, not as separate persons in a shared essence. In the Apocryphon of James, the resurrected Jesus speaks of receiving authority from a higher entity and returning to that entity after completing his mission. These statements highlight a hierarchical relationship rather than ontological equality. The diversity within these texts demonstrates that early Christian theology developed through multiple independent streams. In the Ascension of Isaiah, an influential text among certain early groups, Christ descends through the 7 heavens, each populated by distinct angelic orders. None of these beings recognize him until he reaches the lower realms. His identity is concealed to avoid alerting the higher powers. This narrative portrays Christ as an emissary operating within a cosmic system that contains multiple powerful beings with their own jurisdictions. The highest God exists above this structure, and Christ functions as the envoy of the highest realm. The hierarchical nature of this cosmology stands in contrast to later doctrines that collapse the hierarchy into a single unified identity. The earliest layers of the Hebrew tradition do not begin with a universal deity ruling all existence. They begin with a territorial god whose authority is defined within a specific region and among a specific people. This is evident in the earliest poetic fragments, where the deity later known as YHWH is invoked as the god of a highland tribal confederation. These passages do not claim that he created the entire universe. They emphasize his role as a warrior deity who secures territory, protects a population, and asserts dominance within a geopolitical context. This framework aligns directly with the regional divine models documented across the Levant. The linguistic structure of these early hymns shows that YHWH is treated as one member of a larger divine landscape, not as the sole being in existence. A critical piece of evidence comes from the traces of the divine council in the earliest Hebrew poetry. The council is not symbolic. It is portrayed as a functional governing structure. The oldest manuscripts of key passages retain plural verbs and plural nouns describing divine beings assembled under a presiding high deity. The wording does not suggest metaphorical language. It reflects an inherited belief from the broader Canaanite tradition, where El presides over a council of gods who deliberate on matters of cosmic and earthly governance. In the Hebrew record, YHWH is initially portrayed as a member or champion within this assembly. Only in later redactions does he become its undisputed head, and later still does the council itself fade into abstraction. One of the most revealing texts is the early version of the Distribution of Nations. In its oldest attested form, the passage states that the Most High apportioned the nations among the divine beings, and YHWH received Israel as his allotted portion. This construction presents a theological map where different deities oversee different regions. There is no denial of the existence of other gods. Their legitimacy is assumed. The focus is not universal command but jurisdiction. This framework mirrors the administrative structures of neighboring cultures, where territorial gods receive specific peoples or lands as their domains. The evolution of this passage in later manuscripts reflects a deliberate shift away from divine plurality toward exclusive sovereignty. Archaeological findings reinforce this early pluralistic structure. Inscriptions from sites such as Kantilit Ajrud and Khirbet el-Kom reference YHWH alongside a consort figure, indicating that the deity was once integrated within a broader family structure of divine beings. These inscriptions are not ritual poetry. They are everyday dedications and blessings, providing direct evidence of the lived religious reality in the early Israelite context. The presence of a consort shows that the early worship of YHWH followed the same patterns as surrounding religions, where major gods operated within family networks. The later suppression of these elements demonstrates the theological transformations that occurred during subsequent periods of standardization. The prophetic literature preserves additional layers of this transition. In some of the earliest prophetic oracles, the existence of other gods is acknowledged even as the prophets assert YHWH's superiority. These statements are not framed as philosophical arguments about monotheism. They are competitive declarations within an environment where multiple divine beings are understood to exist. The rhetoric emphasizes YHWH's power over rival deities, not their non-existence. This competitive framework disappears only in later stages, when theological redactors reshape the language to align with emerging monotheistic ideology. The philological differences between older and later forms of these texts provide a clear chronological map of this shift. The transformation accelerates during the period of the monarchy. As the political structure of Israel centralizes, the theological structure begins to centralize with it. Royal inscriptions and court-sponsored religious reforms reflect a process where local cults are suppressed, regional deities are denounced, and rituals not centered on YHWH are targeted for elimination. This consolidation parallels the political unification under the monarchy. Control over religious practice becomes a method of strengthening national identity, and the deity of the state becomes the anchor of that identity. The earlier pluralistic worldview recedes as the monarchy's power grows. The textual shifts in the narrative literature document this progression with precision. During the Babylonian exile, the theological identity of the Hebrew community undergoes its most radical reconstruction. With the monarchy gone and the temple destroyed, scribal groups take on the responsibility of preserving cultural memory. This is the period when earlier texts are collected, edited, combined, and in some cases rewritten. It is also the period when divine plurality becomes theologically incompatible with the new vision of identity emerging among the exiles. As a result, passages referencing the divine council are reinterpreted. Plural forms are reduced. Alternative deities are downgraded to mere idols. YHWH is elevated from national deity to creator of all existence. This shift is not presented as a new revelation in the texts. It emerges through editorial choices visible in comparing early and late manuscript forms. The linguistic evolution of divine titles in this period is another critical indicator. Terms that originally distinguished between different divine beings begin to merge. Titles that once referred to specific functions or hierarchical positions become consolidated into descriptors for a single deity. This process creates the illusion of consistency in later theological frameworks, but when viewed through a chronological lens, it reveals the systematic elimination of earlier divine plurality. The surviving textual variations provide a record of this consolidation. Each shift demonstrates how the theological identity of YHWH was expanded, redefined, and eventually universalized. The earliest scribes recorded a divine landscape filled with conflicting wills, competing authorities, and shifting hierarchies. There is no trace of an all-encompassing deity in these documents. There is structure, but it is political, not metaphysical. There are gods, but they operate like rival administrators in a system where power is negotiated, not inherited. Listeners need to recognize this as the foundational layer because the later theological claims depend entirely on reshaping this chaotic record into something centralized. In the Sumerian king list, divine authority is portrayed as transferable. Kingship descends from one city to another, and the gods linked to those cities rise and fall with the same volatility. Enlil dominates one era, Inanna takes command in another. This rotation is not symbolic. It is treated as factual history and the culture that produced it. These people weren't debating the nature of the divine. They were documenting the political consequences of divine power being inconsistent and unstable. When later traditions assert a single, timeless deity, they are not continuing this story, they are rewriting it from the ground up. The cuneiform myth, the dispute between Enki and Enlil, presents the divine world with internal contradictions. Enki saves humanity during a catastrophe, and Enlil attempts to eradicate it. There is no unified moral direction. Each deity acts on impulse, preference, and strategy. These behaviors were recorded as legitimate divine actions, not as allegories. When monotheistic editors centuries later redacted their own scriptures, these types of contradictions had to be removed, silenced, or reshaped because they did not support the narrative of a single morally coherent creator. But the earlier record remains clear: the gods were not harmonious. They were not consistent. They were not singular. And the scribes who preserved these stories never portrayed them as anything but literal divine conflict. The Ugaritic tablets from Ras Shamra push this even further. In those texts, the high god El presides over a council. Baal challenges authority. Yan demands sovereignty. Mot destroys even the mightiest deities. The structure is explicit: divine beings debate, negotiate, and sometimes kill one another. There is no theological embarrassment in these depictions. The authors do not hide power struggles. They highlight them. This matters because later religious editors would take fragments of these traditions, names, titles, motifs, and hollow out the original political context to create a streamlined monotheistic identity. By the time these materials appear in later writings, the council becomes symbolic, the conflicts become moralized, and the multiplicity is recast as metaphorical. But the earlier version is not metaphorical. It is administrative, bureaucratic, and violent. When the early Hebrew texts begin to appear, they do not deny this older system. They participate in it. The earliest layers of the Hebrew Bible describe divine actions that parallel the neighboring cultures' portrayals: territorial deities, divine councils, and localized authority. The shift towards strict monotheism happens much later. In the earliest strata, divinity is not universal, it is assigned. A deity is linked to a people, a land, a mountain, a region. This is consistent with Mesopotamian, Canaanite, and Egyptian theology. The radical break occurs only when later scribes retroactively redefine the deity of a single nation as the sole creator of everything. That transformation required suppressing older narratives that contained incompatible plural structures, and the editorial fingerprints of that suppression are still visible in philological variants found in the oldest manuscripts. The Dead Sea Scroll fragments reveal textual forms of early passages where references to divine plurality remain intact. These are not interpretations, they are physical manuscript proofs that the earliest tradition preserved a picture of divinity structured as a council, not a monolithic identity. This aligns directly with the Ugaritic model and contradicts later theological frameworks that insist the council imagery is symbolic. The textual evidence shows it is not symbolic. It is inherited from an older Near Eastern worldview that normalized multiple active deities. A detailed examination of the earliest prophetic literature shows another critical pattern: the polemics against other gods appear only after monotheism begins to consolidate. Before that, the texts assume the existence of other divine beings. They are not denied, they are simply ranked. The deity later presented as absolute is originally portrayed as superior among many, not alone among none. This has direct implications for understanding how theological identity was constructed. It means the earliest authors were not defending a universal deity. They were defending the status of their national deity against the claims of others. Creation was not a peaceful emergence. It was a hostile takeover. The older mythic frameworks present deities who gained authority through decisive acts of force, and these events were recorded as historical memory within their cultures. The Enuma Elish, recited annually in Babylon, centers on the rise of Marduk, a deity who does not inherit power but earns it by overpowering previous rulers within the divine hierarchy. In this narrative, Tiamat is not symbolic chaos, she is a primordial being with agency, allies, and a structured cosmological presence. Marduk's victory is described as a literal dismantling of her physical form. The text explains in procedural detail how he divides her body to construct the heavens and the earth. This is not presented as metaphor. It is presented as the mechanical process by which the universe acquired shape. The significance of this record becomes clear when examining how ancient cultures defined authority. Power was not assumed to be inherent. It had to be demonstrated through conquest. The political systems of Mesopotamia mirrored this cosmology. Kings proved legitimacy through military victory and monumental building projects, and their gods mirrored the same expectations. Marduk's elevation is tied directly to his ability to impose order through decisive action. The recitation of his rise during the Akitu festival was not merely religious, it was a public reaffirmation of the divine right of the Babylonian state. This intertwining of theology and political authority is one of the oldest and most consistent patterns in the historical record. When comparing the Enuma Elish to other Mesopotamian creation stories, the shift becomes even more striking. In earlier Sumerian traditions, the cosmic order is established through negotiation between gods like Enki, Enlil, and Ninhursag. These deities interact, debate, and delegate responsibilities. There is no singular act of cosmic violence at the beginning of the world. Instead, creation emerges through structured cooperation. The Babylonian reinterpretation replaces this cooperative model with a hierarchical model where authority is centralized under a single deity whose supremacy is established through victory. This shift marks a radical theological consolidation in response to geopolitical realities, mainly the rise of Babylon as a dominant power. The deeper layer of this development appears when analyzing the linguistic transitions. In the oldest strata of Sumerian myth, divine names are associated with natural forces: wind, water, earth, fertility, each functioning within a distributed system of authority. By the time of the Babylonian Empire, these distributed roles are reorganized under Marduk's name. The list of 50 names assigned to him in the Enuma Elish demonstrates this consolidation. He is granted titles that originally belonged to older gods, signifying an administrative merger of divine portfolios. This shows a deliberate theological strategy, the centralization of divine power through the absorption of previously independent roles. The record makes no attempt to hide this process. It documents it openly as a political and cosmic reality. Another essential piece of evidence comes from the ritual dimensions. During the Akitu festival, the king was required to undergo humiliation rituals before standing in the presence of Marduk's statue. This act symbolized the king's submission to the deity who had reorganized the cosmos through victory. The details of these rituals are preserved in temple archives, and they confirm that Marduk's supremacy was not only theological but institutional. The recitation of the Enuma Elish served as an annual reenactment of cosmic order, creating a direct link between the mythic past and the political present. This connection highlights how creation narratives functioned as foundational documents for state ideology. Moving beyond Babylon, comparative analysis with the Hittite Kumabi cycle uncovers another layer of the ancient divine political pattern. In this tradition, kingship among gods is transferred through violent overthrow across generations. Alalu is dethroned by Anu. Anu is assaulted by Kumabi. Kumabi attempts to destroy Teshub. This sequence demonstrates that the concept of divine succession through conflict was not unique to Babylon. It was embedded across the region. These myths provide a clear contrast to later monotheistic notions of an unchanging, eternal deity. The older worldview assumed divine instability, generational rivalry, and recurrent restructuring of authority. The Egyptian record reinforces this point from yet another angle. In the Memphite theology, Ptah creates through intellectual command, while in the Heliopolitan tradition, Atum brings forth creation through an embodied act. The coexistence of multiple creation models within a single civilization indicates that ancient cultures did not require a unified account of divine action. They accepted plurality without attempting to harmonize contradictions. This stands in sharp contrast to later theological frameworks that insist on a single coherent narrative. The multiplicity preserved in the Egyptian, Hittite, and Mesopotamian texts demonstrates that ancient people were comfortable with divergent origins and overlapping divine roles. When evaluating the earliest Semitic traditions, clear echoes of these mythological structures appear. Names, titles, and divine roles are shared between Ugaritic and Babylonian texts. Bul's conflict with Yam parallels Marduk's conflict with Tiamat in thematic structure. Both narratives involve a younger storm god challenging an older sea deity associated with primordial forces. These parallels indicate a shared cultural memory across the Near East. The theological systems did not develop in isolation. They exchanged motifs, reinterpreted earlier models, and reshaped divine hierarchies in response to shifting political landscapes. The Gnostic texts introduce a structure of divinity that does not resemble the later standardized systems. These writings describe a hierarchy where the highest principle is not involved in crafting the material world. In the Apocryphon of John, the ultimate source is presented as ineffable, ungenerated, and beyond direct description. It exists outside the boundaries of form, time, or cosmic architecture. This entity does not create in the manner familiar from Near Eastern myths. Instead, emanations unfold from it in structured sequences. These emanations are not poetic abstractions. They are defined as actual ontological beings within the Gnostic cosmology, functioning as distinct intelligences. The next level of the hierarchy involves the eons, which are described with specific characteristics, names, and roles. Their existence is not framed as a symbolic representation of ideas. The texts treat them as participants in the structure of the invisible realm. Each eon possesses definable qualities such as foreknowledge, truth, wisdom, and understanding. These attributes are not metaphors, they are described as inherent aspects of each eon's identity. The system operates with precision, eons emerge in pairs, forming syzygies, a configuration that is consistently presented across multiple Gnostic documents. The arrangement reflects a cosmological order where equilibrium is essential. A crucial moment occurs when one eon, Sophia, acts outside the boundaries of that equilibrium. The texts emphasize that this action is not rebellious in a moral sense, it is an impulse born from a desire to generate without her counterpart. The results of this action produce an entity the texts call Yaldabaoth. This being is not framed as evil in the moralistic terms of later theology. He is characterized as ignorant of the higher realms due to his origin outside the full harmony of the eonic structure. The Gnostic texts describe his creation as a cosmological malfunction, not as an ethical failure. This distinction is crucial because it defines the cosmological tension that drives the rest of the narrative. Yaldabaoth's subsequent claim to sole divinity is documented as a direct result of his limited awareness. The texts present him speaking declarations of absolute authority, but the narrative immediately reveals these claims as inaccurate within the broader cosmological context. His proclamations are not lies, they are statements made without knowledge of the realms above him. The Gnostic authors highlight this to emphasize the distinction between power and comprehension. Yaldabaoth possesses creative force, but he lacks understanding of the origin of that force. This framework is foundational for the Gnostic interpretation of the material cosmos. The Apocryphon of John details how Yaldabaoth generates additional entities, known as archons. These beings are described with specific forms, names, and hierarchical positions. Their roles include governing various aspects of the cosmos and assisting in the construction of the material world. The text presents this process in technical detail, listing the attributes of each archon and the cosmic zones they administer. The material world is therefore depicted not as a unified creation but as a layered system assembled through the actions of multiple beings. This multi-tiered structure appears across several Gnostic sources with consistent terminology. The formation of the human being in this cosmology is described through a procedural sequence. The archons attempt to create a being modeled on a reflection they witness from a higher realm. Their attempt fails to animate the figure until a portion of the higher divine essence is introduced. This infusion is not portrayed as a gift but as an unintended consequence of the archons attempting to control what they do not fully understand. The resulting human possesses characteristics that exceed the capacity of its creators. The Gnostic text emphasizes that the human's potential derives from the higher origin of its inner component, not from the archons who constructed its exterior form. A significant detail emerges in the narrative: the archons respond to the human's superior potential with immediate concern. Their reaction is not framed in moral terms. It is presented as a structural problem within the cosmic hierarchy. The archons fear that the human's connection to the higher realms could disrupt their authority within the material domain. This apprehension leads them to impose limitations on the human's awareness. The text outlines specific actions taken to restrict the human's access to its own higher origin. Each restriction is described in operational terms, not symbolic ones. Another important thread in the Gnostic corpus concerns the role of the divine messenger who intervenes in this system. This figure appears not as a redeemer in the conventional theological sense but as a revealer who communicates knowledge of the higher realms. The act of revelation is presented as a destabilizing force within the material structure because it exposes the limitations of the archons and clarifies the true origin of the human essence. The texts describe the messenger delivering instructions regarding the nature of the higher realms, the deception of the archons, and the path of recognition that leads beyond the constraints of the material world. Across multiple Gnostic writings, Yaldabaoth's authority diminishes when confronted with the higher knowledge conveyed by this messenger. His power is based on ignorance rather than inherent supremacy. The archon's authority relies on maintaining the human's unawareness. When that unawareness is interrupted, their dominance is weakened. These dynamics are presented without moral commentary. They form the structural backbone of the Gnostic cosmological model, in which knowledge is the decisive force that reorganizes the hierarchy. The deepest reconstruction of ancient divinity begins with the archaeological record, because the earliest concepts of God are not preserved in systematic theology but in inscriptions, cultic artifacts, and fragmented liturgies distributed across multiple civilizations. When these materials are placed side by side, the pattern is unmistakable. Divine identity was never fixed in the ancient world. It evolved in real time. It adapted to political collapse, administrative reform, territorial expansion, and linguistic shifts. Every change in power produced a corresponding change in the divine hierarchy recorded by the scribes. These transitions are not interpretive theories. They are visible in stratified layers of texts, from Sumerian lexical lists to Hittite ritual tablets to early Hebrew inscriptions. The earliest known references to divine beings come from Mesopotamian protocuneiform accounting tablets. These documents reveal that the divine began as a functional category. Gods were listed alongside grain, livestock, and laborers because offerings had to be recorded. The divine was embedded within the administrative structure. It had no abstract form. The lexical lists that emerged later assigned signs to different deities, each tied to a city, a function, or a natural phenomenon. This system shows that divinity was initially decentralized. Every city maintained its own tutelary deity, and these deities operated within a shared framework without the need for doctrinal unity. As writing matured, the next stage appears in the mythological texts of the early dynastic and Old Babylonian periods. These stories introduce genealogies of gods, but even here, stability is absent. Deities rise and fall in prominence depending on which city controls regional power. When Ur becomes dominant, Nana receives increased liturgical attention. When Akkad rises, Ishtar gains military attributes. When Babylon ascends, Marduk becomes the center of theological consolidation. These shifts occur not because of doctrinal revelation but because scribal schools restructured the divine hierarchy to match political reality. The correlation between political authority and divine elevation is documented repeatedly in royal inscriptions that explicitly credit victorious kings with bringing forth or revealing the supremacy of their preferred deity. In the Western Levant, the Ugaritic texts offer a parallel but distinct trajectory. Here, El stands at the head of the divine council, while Baal functions as the active storm warrior. Their roles reflect environmental and political concerns, agricultural fertility, seasonal rains, and territorial defense. Yet even in this system, changes occur. Some tablets show Baal rising in cultic prominence while others reflect his temporary defeat. The divine landscape is in constant motion. These texts provide a crucial comparative framework because they preserve the Canaanite religious environment that influenced early Israelite theology. They show that divine plurality and shifting divine authority were the norm, not the exception. Early Israelite inscriptions confirm this fluid structure. The phrase YHWH of Samaria and YHWH of Teman found in Kantilit Adrad demonstrates that YHWH was worshipped in multiple regional forms. This is not theological speculation, it is epigraphic evidence. The diversity of titles indicates that the deity's identity was localized before later editors attempted to unify the tradition. At Kerbat Elkom, inscriptions invoke YHWH alongside a divine consort. The presence of this consort is consistent with broader West Semitic religion, where major gods frequently appear as part of family units. That later theological developments erased this element shows how divine identity was reshaped across time, not how it began. The textual evolution within the Hebrew Bible provides a direct window into this transformation. Early poetic fragments, such as portions embedded in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Judges, use language consistent with a divine council. These fragments preserve plural forms describing heavenly beings participating in decision-making processes. Later narrative sections overwrite these forms, but the linguistic fossils remain. When comparing the earliest layers with later redactions, the development is clear. The deity transitions from a territorial god within a council to a singular sovereign occupying the entire cosmic domain. During the monarchy, this transformation accelerates. Royal ideology requires a centralized theological framework to support political unity. Texts produced in or edited by the royal court reflect this shift. The Deuteronomistic historians emphasize exclusive worship of YHWH, condemning cultic practices that involve other deities or localized forms of the same deity. This movement toward exclusivity is political as much as theological. It coincides with attempts to consolidate administrative control under the monarchy, suggesting that theological unification was part of a broader program of national integration. The destruction of the kingdom and the Babylonian exile generate the next major transformation. With temple sacrifice impossible and political autonomy lost, scribal groups adopt a new strategy, preserving identity through text. This period produces some of the most extensive editorial activity in the Hebrew corpus. Older traditions are reinterpreted to emphasize the universal power of the deity. Passages that once portrayed divine plurality are reshaped into declarations of absolute singularity. This shift is not hidden in the text. It is visible in the comparison between the earliest forms of passages preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls and their later canonical versions. The editorial fingerprints show a consistent pattern of theological centralization during and after the exile. The Persian period adds another dimension. Under imperial rule, local deities across the empire were allowed to function within their own traditions, but imperial ideology recognized a supreme cosmic authority. This environment influenced the development of Jewish monotheism. Texts from this period refer to the deity not only as the God of Israel but as the God of all nations. The shift from territorial identity to universal identity aligns with the administrative and ideological structures of the Persian Empire. The deity's universal sovereignty becomes a means of aligning religious identity with imperial cosmology. The Hellenistic period continues this pattern of adaptation. Exposure to Greek philosophical thought introduces new conceptual tools. The deity begins to be described using abstract terms such as wisdom, logos, and mind. These concepts appear in Jewish sapiential literature, which integrates Hellenistic philosophical vocabulary with older Hebrew theological structures. The fusion of these traditions lays the groundwork for the theological diversity seen in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. The deity's identity expands again, demonstrating that theological evolution is not a medieval or modern phenomenon but an ancient one with clearly traceable stages. The sectarian texts from Qumran document yet another layer of development. These writings describe a dualistic cosmic structure populated by angelic beings with specific roles and hierarchies. The deity presides over this structure, but the emphasis is on order, revelation, and predestination. The divine identity reflects the community's interpretation of its own historical situation. The Qumran sect views itself as the remnant of a purer form of worship, and its writings reinterpret older texts through that lens. Once again, divine identity becomes the product of textual reinterpretation in response to historical circumstances. Early rabbinic literature then organizes these diverse traditions into a more systematic framework. Discussions of the divine name, the nature of the heavenly throne, and the role of angelic intermediaries reveal that debates about divine identity continued long after the close of the biblical canon. The rabbis inherit a tradition shaped by Sumerian mythology, Canaanite religion, royal ideology, exilic reinterpretation, Persian universalism, and Hellenistic philosophy. Their task becomes sorting, categorizing, and reconciling these layers. The resulting theological structures bear little resemblance to the earliest forms found in Bronze Age inscriptions, demonstrating how profoundly divine identity had evolved. Across every civilization involved in the ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean world, the same pattern emerges. Divine identity is constructed, expanded, contracted, merged, reinterpreted, and sometimes entirely rewritten. The process is not linear. It reflects centuries of cultural negotiation. The final literary products preserved today represent only the last stage of a long and complex evolution. They contain within them the traces of earlier structures visible through linguistic, archaeological, and comparative analysis. These traces show that the concept of God in the ancient world was never stable. It was built through the accumulated interpretations of thousands of years of human history. Thank you sincerely to everyone who stayed with this video until the end. Your time and attention mean a great deal.